Tuskegee Syphilis Study. In 1932, the United States government began what became one of the most infamous medical crimes in history. In Macon County, Alabama, government doctors recruited hundreds of poor black men into a study. Around 399 of them had syphilis, and another 201 did not. The men were told they were being treated for what doctors called bad blood, a vague local term that could mean many illnesses. But they were not being properly treated at all. The real goal was to watch what untreated syphilis would do to the human body over time. That would already be horrifying enough, but it gets even darker. In the 1940s, penicillin became the standard cure for syphilis. At that point, the government could have ended the experiment and saved lives. Instead, officials actively made sure many of the men did not get the medicine. Some were kept for military treatment. Others were misled or simply never told the truth about what was happening inside their own bodies. The study continued for 40 years. By the time it was exposed in 1972, dozens of men had died directly from syphilis or its complications. Wives had been infected, children had been born with congenital syphilis. The men were not just neglected, they were used, and for decades the government covered it up behind medical language, paperwork, and silence. Katyn Forest Massacre. In 1940, the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, carried out one of the most cold-blooded mass executions of World War II. After the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland, it captured thousands of Polish officers, police, professors, priests, and officials. These were not random prisoners, they were the educated backbone of Poland, the kind of people who could rebuild a nation or resist occupation. Stalin's regime decided they had to disappear. More than 20,000 Polish prisoners were shot, many with a bullet to the back of the head, and buried in mass graves at sites including the Katyn Forest. Then came the cover-up. When new graves were discovered by the Germans in 1943, the Soviet Union immediately blamed the Nazis and stuck to that lie for decades. This was not some quick wartime excuse either, it became official state history. Anyone who challenged it risked censorship, arrest, or worse. For years, the Soviet government forged reports, manipulated evidence, and forced the world to listen to a lie while the families of the dead were left in uncertainty. It was only in 1990, half a century later, that the Soviet leadership finally admitted the truth. By then, the people who ordered the massacre were long gone, and one of the biggest wartime cover-ups in modern history had already done its damage. Argentina's death flights. During Argentina's military dictatorship from 1976 to 1983, the government launched what it called the Dirty War. Officially, it was a campaign against subversion. In reality, it became a system of kidnapping, torture, disappearance, and murder. People were taken from their homes, from the street, from universities, from workplaces. Some were armed militants, many were not. Students, journalists, activists, and suspected opponents simply vanished. One of the most terrifying parts of this system was the death flights. Prisoners were held in secret detention centers, tortured for information, and then selected for what guards cynically called transfer. But this transfer was murder. Victims were drugged, loaded onto military aircraft, flown out over the Atlantic Ocean or the Rio de la Plata, and thrown out alive. The sea became a graveyard with no witnesses and no evidence. For years, the junta denied everything. Families were told their loved ones had run away, joined extremists, or never been detained at all. The word disappeared itself became part of the terror. The government used secrecy as a weapon. It was only after the dictatorship fell that survivors, investigators, and later court trials exposed the scale of what happened. Thousands had been vanished, and the state had spent years pretending they were never there. MKUltra. In the early Cold War, the CIA became obsessed with the idea that foreign powers had discovered mind control. The agency wanted its own methods for breaking people down, controlling behavior, and forcing confessions. Out of that paranoia came MKUltra, a secret program that grew into one of the most disturbing government experiments ever uncovered. Under MKUltra, the CIA funded and carried out experiments on human beings, often without their knowledge or consent. Some people were given LSD or other drugs. Some were subjected to hypnosis, sensory deprivation, extreme psychological pressure, or bizarre combinations of drugs and interrogation methods. Patients in hospitals, prisoners, and ordinary civilians were used in experiments they did not understand. In some cases, the victims never even knew the government had touched their minds. Then came the cover-up. In 1973, as investigations into intelligence abuses began closing in, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered many of the MKUltra files destroyed. That destruction wasn't an accident, it was an attempt to bury the truth. Some documents survived by mistake, which is the only reason the public learned anything at all. Even then, much of the full story was gone forever. The agency had not only experimented on people in secret, it had tried to erase the record of it ever happening. Guatemala syphilis experiments. As if Tuskegee wasn't bad enough, the United States government was involved in another medical crime that stayed hidden even longer. Between 1946 and 1948, U.S. researchers worked in Guatemala on experiments with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases. The goal was to test whether penicillin could prevent infection after exposure, but instead of working with informed volunteers, they used vulnerable people. Prisoners, soldiers, psychiatric patients, and others were deliberately exposed to disease. Some were infected through direct contact with infected sex workers. Others were subjected to even more invasive methods. Many did not understand what was being done to them. Some were never properly treated. The entire thing happened in secret. Unlike Tuskegee, this crime remained buried for decades. It was only brought to public attention in 2010 when a historian uncovered the records. That means people had died, suffered, and been used in government medical experiments, while the truth sat hidden in archives. The official apology came generations later, long after the victims had lived with consequences they never chose. Tlatelolco Massacre. On October 2, 1968, just days before Mexico City hosted the Olympic Games, thousands of students and civilians gathered in the Plaza of the Three Cultures in Tlatelolco. They were protesting government repression and demanding reform. The state wanted the world to see a modern, stable Mexico before the Olympics began. Instead, it chose violence. As the crowd gathered, security forces surrounded the area. Then, shooting began. Soldiers and police fired into the crowd. Panic exploded across the square. People ran, hid, or dropped to the ground. Many were killed, many more were wounded or arrested. The exact number of dead remains disputed, which is part of what makes the whole thing so disturbing. Some estimates are in the dozens, others are far higher. The cover-up started immediately. The government blamed armed agitators and presented the massacre as if the state had responded to provocation. It minimized the death toll, controlled the press, and forced the world to listen to a lie, while the families of the dead were left in uncertainty. It was only long after that the real scale of what happened began to surface as new generations demanded answers. This cover-up was an everyday practice for years. Canada's residential schools. For generations, Indigenous children in Canada were taken from their families and forced into residential schools backed by the government and often run by churches. Officials claimed these schools would civilize and educate the children. In reality, the system was built to erase Indigenous identity, language, family ties, and culture. Children were separated from home, punished for speaking their own languages, and subjected to neglect, violence, and abuse. Many children never came back. What makes this story especially dark is how long the truth was minimized or ignored. Families knew children had vanished. Survivors told stories of beatings, sexual abuse, hunger, disease, and graves. But the broader system buried their voices. Records were incomplete, deaths were often poorly documented. Governments and institutions spent years hiding behind paperwork, denials, or half-admissions. In recent years, the discovery of burial sites and unmarked graves near former school grounds forced a wider public confrontation with what survivors had been saying all along. The horror was not suddenly created by those discoveries, it had been there the whole time. The real shock was how long a government-backed system of cultural destruction and child suffering had been allowed to hide behind national myth.